In the early morning hours of May 1941, aboard the HMS Ark Royal in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, something extraordinary was happening. While sailors rushed to their battle stations, a small orange tabby cat named Oscar paced frantically along the ship's deck, his fur standing on end, emitting low, persistent growls that cut through the sound of waves crashing against the hull. The crew had learned to recognize this behavior, and what it meant chilled them to their core. 10 minutes later, the call came from the radar room confirming what Oscar already knew. Enemy submarines were closing in on their position. If you're enjoying this incredible true story of survival and instinct, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more amazing historical tales that deserve to be remembered. Oscar wasn't always a sailor. In the spring of 1940, he was just another stray wandering the bombed-out streets of Portsmouth, England, searching through rubble for scraps of food. The war had transformed the coastal city into a landscape of destruction, where the constant wail of air raid sirens had become as familiar as the cry of seagulls. The docks were a dangerous place, with ships coming and going at all hours, supplies being loaded under the cover of darkness, and military personnel moving with urgent purpose through the smoky, diesel-scented air. It was there that Petty Officer James Fletcher first encountered the small cat, huddled beneath a loading crane, his orange fur matted with rain and grime. Fletcher, a veteran sailor in his early 30s with weathered hands and kind eyes, had always had a soft spot for animals. Despite the regulations, despite the chaos of wartime, he couldn't leave the creature to face the brutal English winter alone. He wrapped Oscar in his jacket and smuggled him aboard the German battleship Bismarck, where Fletcher was temporarily assigned as part of a joint naval observation mission before the ship's official commissioning. The Bismarck was a floating fortress, the pride of the German Kriegsmarine, stretching over 800 feet long with armor plating that seemed impenetrable. Fletcher worked in the lower decks, maintaining communication equipment, and Oscar quickly adapted to life at sea. The massive ship was a city unto itself, with over 2,000 crew members working in a complex hierarchy of ranks and responsibilities. The corridors smelled of oil, metal, and the ever-present dampness of the sea. Steam pipes hissed and clanked overhead, and the constant vibration of the enormous engines became a rhythm that sailors learned to sleep through. Oscar established his territory with the confidence of a natural survivor. He would curl up near the warm engine rooms, where the chief engineer, a burly German named Klaus, who spoke no English, would save him scraps from his own meals. The cat would chase rats through the narrow corridors with a ferocity that earned respect from even the hardest sailors. Rats were more than just a nuisance aboard ships. They contaminated food supplies, chewed through electrical wiring, and spread disease in the confined quarters where hundreds of men lived in close proximity. Oscar's hunting prowess made him valuable beyond mere companionship. He occasionally appeared at mealtimes in the crew mess, where sympathetic sailors from different backgrounds would slip him bits of fish or meat. Fletcher watched as men who couldn't exchange 10 words due to language barriers would smile and gesture while feeding the small cat. There was something about Oscar's presence that transcended the divisions of nationality and language. In those brief moments of normalcy, gathered around a small orange tabby, they were simply men far from home, seeking comfort in the smallest reminder that life existed beyond the war. The first weeks aboard the Bismarck were relatively peaceful, filled with training exercises and preparations for the ship's maiden voyage. Fletcher spent his days in the radio room, listening to coded transmissions and maintaining the sophisticated communication equipment that kept the battleship connected to Naval Command. Oscar would often sleep on a cushion Fletcher had fashioned from an old sweater, his presence a calming influence during the long hours of monitoring static and encrypted messages. Fletcher had joined the Royal Navy at 18, fresh from a fishing village in Cornwall where his family had worked the sea for generations. He understood the ocean's moods, respected its power, and had that innate sense of the water that marked true sailors. At 32, he had survived the early years of the war, seen friends die in the cold Atlantic, and developed the hardened exterior that military life demanded. But Oscar had cracked that exterior, reminding him of the cat his daughter had back home, a small tabby named Whiskers, who she wrote about in her letters. Those letters were Fletcher's lifeline. His wife Margaret would write every week, her neat handwriting filling pages with news from home. She told him about their daughter Emma, now 7 years old, who was growing up too fast in his absence. She described the rationing, the air raids, the constant fear that gripped their coastal village as German bombers flew overhead toward larger cities. She never complained, never asked him to come home, but he could read between the lines and feel her worry, her loneliness, her determination to keep their family strong until he returned. But Oscar's first brush with death came far sooner than anyone expected. On May 27, 1941, the Bismarck engaged in a fierce battle with British forces in the Denmark Strait. The morning had started with tension, every man aboard knowing they were sailing into hostile waters where the British fleet was actively hunting them. The officers moved with grim determination, checking and rechecking equipment, while the gun crews stood ready at their massive cannons. Oscar had been unusually restless that morning, pacing the corridors with his ears flat. But in the chaos of battle preparation, few noticed his distress. Fletcher was below deck in the communications room when the first shell struck. The impact was beyond anything he could have imagined, a sound so loud it felt like the world was ending. The massive explosion threw him against a bulkhead with enough force to crack 2 ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. The lights flickered and died, plunging the corridor into darkness broken only by emergency lighting that cast everything in an eerie red glow. Alarms screamed throughout the ship, a cacophony of different warnings blending into one terrible song of destruction. The acrid smell of burning metal, explosive chemicals, and something worse, the unmistakable scent of burning flesh filled the air and made him gag. Water began flooding the lower compartments almost immediately. Fletcher could hear it rushing through ruptured bulkheads, a roaring sound that grew louder with each passing second. The ship shuddered with each impact as British shells found their mark, tearing through even the Bismarck's legendary armor. Men were screaming, some calling for help, others simply crying out in pain and fear. The deck beneath his feet tilted at an unnatural angle, and he knew with absolute certainty that the great ship was dying. In the chaos and terror of the sinking ship, as men scrambled for lifeboats and the vessel listed dangerously to one side, Fletcher's training took over. He should have been heading topside, making for the life rafts, ensuring his own survival. But the thought of leaving Oscar trapped somewhere in these flooding corridors was unbearable. The cat had become more than a pet or mascot. He represented something innocent and pure in a world gone mad with violence. Fletcher couldn't save the Bismarck or its crew, but he could try to save one small life. He fought his way through the flooding corridors, the water now waist deep and rising fast. The emergency lighting was failing in sections, leaving patches of absolute darkness where he had to feel his way along the walls. Bodies floated past him in the water, men who hadn't made it out, their faces pale and vacant in death. The cold Atlantic water numbed his legs and made every movement exhausting. He called Oscar's name repeatedly, his voice hoarse with smoke inhalation and desperation, knowing it was probably futile but unable to give up. He found the cat clinging to a floating piece of debris in a half-submerged passageway near the engine room, his green eyes wide with terror but somehow still alert, still fighting. Oscar's claws were embedded in the wooden plank, his fur soaked and plastered to his small body, making him look pathetically tiny. When he saw Fletcher, he let out a pitiful meow that broke something in the sailor's heart. Fletcher grabbed him and tucked him inside his jacket, feeling the cat's rapid heartbeat against his chest, and fought his way topside through corridors that were rapidly becoming death traps. The scene on deck was apocalyptic. The great battleship was going down, its massive hull groaning and shuddering as the sea claimed it with greedy fingers. Fire and smoke poured from gaping wounds in the superstructure. Men were jumping into the freezing Atlantic water, preferring to take their chances with the sea rather than be dragged down with the ship. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the chaos. Life rafts were being thrown overboard, many already overcrowded with desperate survivors. The air was filled with the sounds of secondary explosions, screaming metal, and human cries of fear and pain. Fletcher made it to the rail and jumped without hesitation. The fall seemed to last forever, the wind rushing past his ears, Oscar's claws digging painfully into his chest through his jacket. They hit the water with brutal force, the cold so intense it felt like 1,000 knives stabbing every inch of his body. He kicked hard to surface, one arm wrapped protectively around Oscar inside his jacket, fighting the weight of his waterlogged uniform and boots. They floated in the freezing Atlantic for nearly 3 hours before being picked up by the British destroyer HMS Cossack. Fletcher held Oscar against his chest the entire time, sharing what little body heat he had left, talking to the cat to keep himself conscious and alert. He watched other survivors around him slowly succumb to hypothermia, their voices fading to silence as the cold claimed them one by one. Some drifted away on the current, others simply slipped beneath the surface, too exhausted to keep fighting. Fletcher talked about his daughter Emma, about how she would love Oscar, about the cottage by the sea where they would all live when the war was over. He talked about warm fires and fresh fish and lazy afternoons in the sun. He talked to keep the darkness at bay, to remind himself why survival mattered, to give his frozen mind something to focus on besides the numbing cold that was slowly stealing his strength. Oscar remained pressed against him, occasionally meowing softly as if responding to his voice, encouraging him to keep going. The British crew was surprised to find a survivor from the Bismarck, but even more surprised by his small feline companion. Fletcher, suffering from hypothermia and shock, held Oscar close as they were brought aboard. The cat had survived the sinking of one of the most powerful warships ever built. The British sailors, respecting the tradition of ship's cats bringing good luck, decided to keep Oscar aboard, and Fletcher, as a British officer who had been on observation duty, was reassigned to the Cossack's crew. Life aboard the Cossack was different from the Bismarck. The destroyer was smaller, faster, more agile, designed for escort duties and anti-submarine warfare rather than the massive broadside battles that battleships were built for. Everything was more cramped, more intimate. You couldn't walk 10 feet without bumping into another sailor. The crew quarters were tight. The mess hall could barely fit 50 men at a time, and privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. But there was a camaraderie here that Fletcher hadn't experienced on the larger ship, a sense of brotherhood that came from shared danger in close quarters. Oscar adapted quickly to his new home, establishing his territory in the communications room where Fletcher worked. The crew grew fond of him almost immediately, especially after what they'd been through together. The story of how Fletcher had risked his life to save the cat from the sinking Bismarck had spread through the ship within hours, and it had earned both of them a special place in the crew's affections. Sailors would stop by the communications room just to check on Oscar, to scratch behind his ears, to share a bit of their rations. But it was Oscar's behavior in the weeks following their rescue that truly captured everyone's attention. The first incident happened on a moonless night in June, about 3 weeks after they'd come aboard. Fletcher was on the late watch, monitoring radio traffic and updating convoy positions on the charts. Oscar was sleeping on his usual cushion, curled into a tight ball, seemingly at peace. The sea was calm, the night quiet except for the steady throb of the destroyer's engines and the occasional crackle of radio static. At exactly 2320 hours, Oscar's head suddenly jerked up. His ears rotated forward, then flattened back against his skull. He stood up, his back arched, and began to pace back and forth along the communication desk with unusual agitation. A low growl started deep in his throat, continuous and unsettling. Fletcher had never heard him make that sound before. The fur along Oscar's spine stood straight up, making him look larger and more menacing than his small size would suggest. Fletcher felt the hairs on his own neck stand up. There was something primal in Oscar's behavior, something that triggered an ancient alarm in his own nervous system. He reached for the intercom without fully understanding why. Something in the cat's reaction demanded action. He pressed the button and spoke with more urgency than the situation seemed to warrant. "Bridge, this is communications." "Something's wrong. I can't explain it, but I think we should go to alert status." The officer on duty, Lieutenant Morris, was skeptical. "Fletcher, we have nothing on sonar. Radar is clear. What exactly are you reporting?" Fletcher glanced at Oscar, who was now staring fixedly toward the port side, his growl intensifying. "Sir, I know this sounds strange, but the cat is showing signs of extreme distress. He's acting like there's danger nearby." There was a long pause. Fletcher could imagine Morris rolling his eyes at the absurdity of putting the ship on alert because of a cat's behavior. But Morris was also a good officer, who knew that strange things happened at sea, and that instinct sometimes mattered more than instruments. "Very well, Fletcher. I'll have sonar do a deep sweep. But this better not be because Oscar wants his dinner." 15 minutes later, the sonar operator reported contacts. A German U-boat, running silent at depth, positioning for an attack on their convoy. The Cossack's quick response, dropping depth charges based on the sonar bearing, forced the submarine to dive deeper and abandon its attack run. The convoy sailed on unmolested, and Oscar's strange behavior ceased the moment the submarine retreated beyond detection range. Lieutenant Commander Harrison, the ship's captain, summoned Fletcher to his quarters the next morning. Harrison was a stern man in his 40s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much death. He ran the Cossack with military precision and had little patience for superstition or nonsense. He poured 2 cups of strong tea and gestured for Fletcher to sit. "Tell me about the cat," he said simply. Fletcher explained Oscar's behavior, his obvious distress, the timing of it all. Harrison listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Fletcher finished, Harrison was quiet for a long moment, staring into his tea as if it might hold answers. "I've been at sea for 23 years, he finally said. "I've seen things I can't explain. I've known sailors who could predict storms before any instruments showed a change. I've seen dolphins lead ships away from minefields. The sea has mysteries we don't understand." He looked directly at Fletcher. "I'm not going to dismiss this. If Oscar shows that behavior again, I want to know immediately. We'll treat it as a valid warning until proven otherwise. The lives of this crew are more valuable than my pride." The second incident came 3 weeks later. Oscar exhibited the same behavior, the same agitation, the same directional focus and low growling. This time, Harrison ordered immediate sonar sweeps without hesitation. They detected 2 U-boats working in coordination, setting up a wolf-pack ambush. The Cossacks' early warning allowed them to reposition the convoy and call in additional escorts. The submarines, realizing they'd lost the element of surprise, withdrew without engaging. 0 casualties, 0 damage, all because of a cat who somehow knew danger was approaching. After the third time Oscar's behavior preceded a submarine detection, even the most skeptical crew members became believers. Scientists might explain it as the cat's sensitivity to subtle vibrations through the water, or perhaps his acute hearing picking up frequencies humans couldn't detect. Some theorized that Oscar could sense the electromagnetic fields generated by the U-boat's electric motors. Others suggested he was responding to pressure changes as submarines maneuvered at depth. But to the sailors of the Cossack, the explanation didn't matter. What mattered was that Oscar's warnings were accurate, consistent, and came with enough advance notice to prepare defenses or take evasive action. Fletcher became something of a celebrity on the ship, not for his own actions, but for his association with Oscar. Other sailors would ask him questions. How does the cat know? Can he detect surface ships too? Does he react to friendly submarines? Fletcher had no answers, but he paid close attention to every detail of Oscar's behavior, learning to distinguish between normal feline moods and the specific pattern that indicated submarine danger. The directional focus was key. Oscar would always stare toward the location of the threat. The intensity of his reaction seemed to correlate with how close the danger was. Harrison started keeping Fletcher and Oscar on bridge duty during high-risk periods. It became routine. When Oscar showed warning signs, Harrison would order the helmsman to alter course away from the direction of Oscar's focus, while the sonar operators intensified their search patterns. It saved lives more than once, giving the Cossack those crucial extra minutes to respond to threats that their instruments hadn't yet detected. The autumn of 1941 brought increasingly dangerous conditions. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships at an alarming rate, in what would later be known as the Second Happy Time. The Cossack was assigned to convoy escort duty, protecting merchant vessels carrying vital supplies from America to Britain. The North Atlantic was a graveyard of ships, the cold, dark waters hiding predators that could strike without warning. On October 23rd, Fletcher was on duty in the communications room, monitoring radio traffic between convoy ships. It had been a long day of routine transmissions and weather reports. Oscar lay curled on his warm spot near the radio equipment, seemingly at peace, his breathing slow and steady as he dozed. The sea was rough that evening, with waves crashing over the destroyer's bow and rain hammering against the metal hull like 1,000 angry fists. Visibility was poor, the darkness absolute, the kind of night where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. These were perfect conditions for submarine attacks, and everyone knew it. The tension aboard ship was palpable, every sailor moving with heightened awareness, every sound analyzed for potential threat. Fletcher had been reading a letter from Margaret, written 3 weeks earlier and delivered with the last mail call. Emma had learned to ride a bicycle, his daughter's achievement recorded in his wife's careful handwriting. Such a normal, everyday milestone, happening in a world that felt impossibly distant from this dark ship on a hostile sea. He read the letter twice, trying to picture his daughter's face, wondering how much she had changed in the 2 years since he'd seen her. Would she even recognize him when he finally came home? At exactly 2147 hours, Oscar suddenly leaped to his feet. His transformation was instantaneous and startling. His fur bristled, making him look twice his normal size. He began that distinctive low growl, the sound that every sailor on the Cossack had learned to dread and respect. He paced back and forth along the communication desk, his movements jerky with urgency, occasionally stopping to stare with laser focus toward the starboard side of the ship. Fletcher felt his heart rate spike. He'd seen this behavior enough times to know what it meant, but the intensity of Oscar's reaction tonight was beyond anything he'd witnessed before. Fletcher immediately reached for the intercom, his hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Bridge, this is communications. Oscar's showing warning signs. Recommend immediate alert status." His voice was calm, professional, but carried an edge of urgency that needed no explanation. Lieutenant Commander Harrison, who had learned to trust the cat's instincts implicitly, immediately ordered the crew to battle stations and requested a full sonar sweep. The klaxons began wailing throughout the ship, and Fletcher heard the sound of running feet as sailors raced to their positions. 8 minutes later, the sonar operator reported contacts. 2 U-boats positioning for a coordinated attack on the convoy. They were running silent, using the rough seas and poor visibility as cover for their approach. The Cossacks' quick response, dropping depth charges at the computed locations, forced both submarines to dive deep and lose their targeting solutions. The explosions lit up the dark water with phosphorescent flashes, and the concussive force could be felt through the ship's hull. For a moment, it seemed they had escaped again, that Oscar's warning had once more saved them from disaster. But the Germans were persistent, and they were angry. At 2236 hours, a torpedo struck the Cossack amidships, the explosion tearing through the engine room and killing 17 men instantly. The blast was catastrophic, different from the shell impacts on the Bismarck. This felt more personal, more targeted, as if the sea itself had reached up to grab the ship. The explosion threw Fletcher to the floor of the communications room, his head striking the edge of the radio console. Blood flowed warm down his face and his vision blurred. Oscar disappeared in the chaos as the lights went out and emergency klaxons began wailing a different, more desperate warning. The ship was mortally wounded. Water flooded the lower decks with terrifying speed, and the Cossack began listing heavily to starboard. The angle of the deck increased with each passing minute, making movement difficult and dangerous. Fletcher struggled to his feet, tasting blood in his mouth, and joined the desperate search for survivors in the darkened corridors below. The ship was dying, groaning and creaking as the sea pulled it down with inexorable force. Metal twisted and snapped, bulkheads collapsed, and the sounds of men crying out in pain and fear echoed through the passages. He called for Oscar, his voice hoarse with smoke and desperation, but heard nothing over the sound of rushing water and distant explosions as other ships in the convoy fought off the submarine pack. The red emergency lighting flickered and failed in sections, leaving him to navigate by touch through spaces he'd walked 1,000 times, but which now felt alien and threatening. He found 3 sailors trapped behind a jammed hatch and worked with others to free them, precious minutes ticking away as the ship settled deeper into the water. He was about to give up on finding Oscar, to accept that this time the cat's luck had run out, when he heard a faint meow from behind a collapsed bulkhead. The sound was barely audible over the chaos, but Fletcher's ears had become attuned to Oscar's voice over the months they'd served together. Working frantically with 2 other sailors, their hands bleeding from the sharp edges of torn metal, Fletcher cleared enough debris to find Oscar trapped in a small air pocket, wet and terrified, but alive. The cat launched himself at Fletcher the moment he had clearance, claws digging into his uniform, meowing piteously. They made it topside, just as the order came to abandon ship. The deck was tilted at a dangerous angle now, men sliding and grabbing for handholds as they tried to reach the remaining lifeboats. The sea was rough, making the launches difficult and dangerous. Fletcher held Oscar tight against his chest, one arm wrapped protectively around the cat, as he waited his turn. The Cossack shuddered beneath them, and he could feel the ship's death throes through the soles of his boots. She had been a good ship, a lucky ship until tonight, and she deserved better than to die in these cold waters. He jumped when his turn came, hitting the water hard and fighting his way to the nearest lifeboat. Hands reached down to pull him aboard, and he passed Oscar up first before allowing himself to be hauled over the gunwale. They watched from the lifeboat as the Cossack fought her final battle with the sea. The ship refused to go quickly, listing further and further but maintaining some defiant measure of buoyancy. Attempts were made to take her under tow, but the damage was too severe, the flooding too extensive. 2 hours after the torpedo strike, the Cossack finally gave up her fight and slipped beneath the waves, her bow rising high one last time before she disappeared into the depths. Fletcher held Oscar in the lifeboat, both of them shivering in the cold wind, and counted the losses. 17 dead in the initial explosion, 3 more lost in the evacuation, and 1 sailor who had been in the water too long before being rescued, succumbing to hypothermia despite the crew's best efforts to save him. 21 men who wouldn't be going home to their families, wouldn't see another sunrise, wouldn't have the chance to rebuild their lives when this war finally ended. The weight of survival felt heavy in that moment, the question of why he and Oscar kept living while so many others died. They were picked up by HMS Legion, another destroyer, and this time the story of Oscar, the cat who had survived 2 sinkings, spread throughout the fleet. Sailors are superstitious by nature, and many saw Oscar as blessed, a survivor against impossible odds. Others wondered if he might be cursed, bringing doom to whatever ship he sailed on. But Fletcher wouldn't hear such talk. He had served with good men on both ships, and their deaths weren't the fault of a cat who had done nothing but try to warn them of danger. Oscar's reputation as an early warning system continued aboard the Legion. His ability to sense submarines remained uncanny, and the Legion's crew learned to trust his instincts implicitly. Captain Reynolds, a practical man who put little stock in superstition, nonetheless found himself ordering sonar checks whenever the ship's cat became agitated. More than once, Oscar's warnings gave them the crucial minutes needed to take evasive action or prepare for attack. The winter of 1941 turned into spring of 1942, and the war in the Atlantic intensified. The Legion was involved in multiple convoy actions, fighting off submarine attacks and protecting the vital supply lines that kept Britain in the war. Oscar became a familiar sight on the bridge during night watches, his orange fur a spot of warmth and life in the cold darkness of the wartime sea. Fletcher grew even more attached to the cat. In the long hours between watches, he would tell Oscar about his home in Cornwall, about the wife and daughter he hadn't seen in 2 years, about the life he hoped to return to when the war finally ended. Oscar would purr and knead his paws, offering the kind of unconditional companionship that helped keep Fletcher sane in the midst of so much death and destruction. But fate had one more test for both of them. On March 16, 1942, the Legion was conducting anti-submarine patrols south of Malta when Oscar began showing warning signs again. This time, his reaction was more intense than Fletcher had ever seen. The cat was nearly frantic, racing back and forth across the bridge, his growls almost constant. Captain Reynolds immediately ordered battle stations and evasive maneuvers. The U-boat attack came 7 minutes later. 2 torpedoes, launched from different angles, both aimed at the Legion's vulnerable sides. The first one missed by mere feet, its wake clearly visible in the moonlight. The second torpedo struck aft, near the stern, the explosion lifting the rear of the ship partially out of the water before it crashed back down. The damage was catastrophic. The rudder was destroyed, the propeller shafts bent beyond repair, and water flooded the aft compartments faster than the pumps could handle. Fletcher grabbed Oscar and held him close as the ship began its final death throes. This time, there was no prolonged struggle. The Legion was sinking fast, and the order to abandon ship came within minutes. Fletcher jumped into the Mediterranean with Oscar clutched against his chest, the cat's claws digging into his uniform as they hit the cold water. Around them, other sailors were swimming toward lifeboats or clinging to debris, and the Legion's bow rose high into the air before the ship slid backward into the depths. They were rescued within an hour by HMS Pathfinder, a minesweeper that had responded to the Legion's distress call. As Fletcher climbed aboard with Oscar, the minesweeper's crew stared in disbelief. Word had already spread through the fleet about the cat who had survived 3 sinkings. Some sailors refused to be near Oscar, crossing themselves and muttering about omens. Others wanted to touch him, as if his survival might bring them luck. The captain of the Pathfinder, Commander Wilson, made a decision that would save both Fletcher and Oscar from a 4th potential sinking. "I've heard about this cat," Wilson said, looking at the bedraggled animal in Fletcher's arms. 3 ships gone down, and he's still here. I think it's time Oscar retired from active service. I'm recommending that both of you be reassigned to shore duty. We need experienced communications officers in Gibraltar, and Oscar has earned his place in naval history. Fletcher felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had survived 3 sinkings, lost countless friends and shipmates, and somehow, against all odds, kept Oscar alive through it all. The thought of returning to a ship, of facing those cold Atlantic waters again, filled him with a dread he could barely acknowledge. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "I think we've both had enough of the sea for one war." In May 1942, Fletcher and Oscar were transferred to the naval base at Gibraltar. Fletcher worked in naval communications, coordinating convoy movements and submarine reports. Oscar, now famous throughout the Mediterranean fleet, lived in the officers' quarters, where he was fed and pampered by sailors who saw him as a living legend. His days of sensing submarines were over, but his uncanny abilities hadn't diminished. Even on land, he would sometimes become agitated minutes before air raid sirens announced incoming German bombers. As the war years passed, Oscar became something more than just a ship's cat who had survived 3 sinkings. He became a symbol of survival, of the strange and inexplicable elements of war that defied logical explanation. Naval records documented his service, noting his presence aboard the Bismarck, Cossack, and Legion, making him perhaps the only cat to serve on both sides of the conflict and live to tell the tale. Fletcher remained at Gibraltar until the war's end in 1945. When peace finally came, he returned to England with Oscar, now a grizzled veteran of 9 years. They settled in a small cottage in Cornwall, where Oscar spent his remaining years as a house cat, never again hearing the sound of torpedoes or feeling the deck of a warship beneath his paws. Fletcher would often sit by the fireplace with Oscar curled in his lap, telling his daughter about the incredible cat who had saved countless lives with his mysterious ability to sense danger before it struck. Oscar passed away peacefully in 1949, in his sleep far from the cold waters of the Atlantic. Fletcher buried him in the garden with full honors, fashioning a small wooden marker that read, "Oscar, Unsinkable Sam, Ship's Cat, survivor of Bismarck, Cossack, and Legion. He knew what we couldn't see." Scientists and historians have long debated Oscar's abilities. Some suggest he was sensitive to the ultrasonic frequencies produced by submarine propellers. Others point to his ability to detect minute vibrations through water. But those who served with him, who saw his warning save lives time and again, needed no scientific explanation. They knew that in the chaos and terror of naval warfare, Oscar possessed something that defied measurement or analysis, a 6th sense that made him perhaps the most valuable crew member any ship could have. The story of Oscar, often called Unsinkable Sam in naval records, remains one of the most extraordinary tales to emerge from World War II. He survived the sinking of 3 warships, served on both sides of the conflict, and possessed an ability to detect submarines that was never fully explained. His legacy lives on in naval museums and historical records, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, unexpected heroes can emerge from the most unlikely places. Fletcher himself lived until 1987, never losing his love for cats, and never forgetting the small orange tabby who had shared his war. In his final years, he would tell anyone who would listen about Oscar, about the cat who could sense death approaching beneath the waves, about the companion who had given him a reason to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. And on quiet nights, he would swear he could still hear that distinctive low growl that meant danger was coming, a sound that had saved his life more times than he could count, carried across the decades by a bond forged in the fire and salt water of the Second World War.